I'm your co-host, Brian, along with Jacob. Today, our guest is Daniel Wiebe, a former Jehovah's Witness, born into the faith, and left about 2 years ago at the age of 36. He had reached pioneer status in the Jehovah's Witness, which means you commit to 70 hours per month of door-to-door visits, and was also a ministerial servant, which is one step below elder. So he definitely understands and had reached fairly high places within the JW culture and is now an apostate. And joining us now, welcome, Daniel Wiebe.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. Wow, I did not know. So there are ranks there. I'm kind of a layman. I don't know very much about the Jehovah's Witnesses. So there are ranks then.
Certainly, yeah. As you mentioned, I was a ministerial servant, which is essentially a deacon in most churches.
Okay.
One dramatic difference between Jehovah's Witnesses and your average mainstream church is that there's no priest. There's no single person that you expect to see every Sunday. So they have a body of elders instead. And every Sunday you're going to have a different speaker, might be an elder from a different congregation. So it's a little different structure than that in that way. But otherwise, it's very much a pyramid-shaped organization with a leadership at the top. And then there's overseers underneath them that go out to the different congregations. Then you have the elders, ministerial servants, pioneers. And way there at the bottom, you have women.
Wow. That's pretty brutal. I didn't expect that last sentence to happen. Well, I guess I should have. I know you've talked about in the past, I've watched some of your videos, and you were comparing it to a cult.
Yes.
Do you think it is a cult, ultimately?
I do. This is an interesting conversation when talking to non-believers, because I've talked to a lot of non-believers. I don't know how you guys feel, but a lot of non-believers have the idea that all religions are cults. I don't find that to be particularly useful, although I do understand what they mean when they say it, because really any religion is going to be using deception to some extent, knowingly or unknowingly. There's deception in there because it's structured around something that isn't true. But my position on that is people want to be lied to, and that's why you have religions existing. The difference between what I would consider a cult, which is an authoritarian religion that uses phobia indoctrination, information control, and deceptive recruitment tactics. Well, I guess I just listed some of the differences.
Yeah.
If you were to talk to 10 different Catholics, you're going to get 10 different worldviews. There's going to be certain things they all agree on, but if you ask them about doctrine, some of them might not even know what the doctrine is. Whereas with the Jehovah's Witnesses, you ask 10 different Jehovah's Witnesses, you're going to get the exact same answer from all of them. And they would actually have fear about giving a different answer because lacking total agreement with the leadership of that organization is apostasy. It's not just leaving the church. It's you could have an apostate thought just by disagreeing with a certain aspect of their doctrine. So it's a higher level of control. I could talk about this a lot. I have a number of videos on my channel about this. I think one of the most clear differences between what I would consider a destructive or authoritarian religion and a mainstream Christian religion or whatever denomination, world religion, is how hard is it to leave? And if leaving means you're going to be shunned by everybody you care about, that's a pretty big red flag that you're in a cult and not just in an ordinary religion.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, you could look at even the MLMs like Amway as being sort of a secular cult, maybe worshiping the almighty dollar instead. But when you say, how hard is it to leave? Mm-hmm. And I've met ex-Amway members that, once you're out, you're out. I mean, too.
And I don't want to dismiss anybody's experience here. I mean, you could have that experience of being shunned and be a Catholic. I mean, there's families that are essentially work like a family cult where they take the Catholic Church so seriously, that to leave the church would mean losing your family. It's really, it's a spectrum. You can't say this religion is a cult, this religion isn't. Different religions are more cult-like than others. Stephen Hessen is probably one of the most helpful people in this department. He came up, he used to be a Mooney. Remember the Moonies?
No. I don't even know what that is. I won't lie.
It's the unification.
The Goonies. He knows what that is.
I know what the Goonies are. Yeah, I'm familiar with them.
Fan of the Goonies, not so much a fan of the Moonies. The Moonies, that's the Unification Church. I want to say that it's a Korean Korean cult. He was, brainwashed, although I'm not a big fan of the term brainwashed, but he was recruited into this organization and everything changed in his life. He stopped associating with his family as much. And that's another big red flag. If they want you to separate from people that aren't members, and that's very much the case with Jehovah's Witnesses, was the case with the Moonies. And ultimately he was deprogrammed. His family kind of got some people that were former members to talk to him, and he was deprogrammed. And his experience was so intense that he decided to devote his life to cults and educating people about how undue influence, which is the legal term for mind control, how undue influence works. And he outlined something called the BITE model, which is behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. That's something that I've been doing on my channel. So far, I've gone through behavior control and information control, how every point on his list under each of those categories applies. Almost every point. There's a few that don't. But how they apply to Jehovah's Witnesses. So that's what you got to do. If you're in a religion, I would recommend going to freedomofmind.com. That's his website. And he's got the BITE model outlined there. And you can go through every point and see, just honestly look at it and say, does this match the organization I'm in? And it doesn't have to even be a religious organization. Like you said, it could be
a multi-level marketing.
It could be a political organization, self-help groups. I mean, Scientology claims to be a religion, but it's essentially a self-help group. Landmark Forum, it's kind of like a spin-off of Scientology, not religious at all. It's a self-help group, but it functions very much like a cult if you look at how it works and compare it against the BITE model. Robert Lifton, he provided another great list in the book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He listed out 8 criteria for thought reform, and that's another good list. It's obviously not as comprehensive as Stephen Hessen's, but it's helpful.
Awesome. When you were talking about that just now, you said you did not like the term brainwashing. Why is that?
It has some, obviously negative connotations, but that was like wartime stuff that they would do, where they would like sit somebody down and torment them physically to try to get them to agree to something. And you can get somebody to agree to something in the short term through brainwashing, but as soon as you separate them from that influence, they revert back to their previous beliefs.
Oh, okay.
Whereas undue influence is a process where you actually change the structure of somebody's mind to the point that they really take on these beliefs. And they stick with it much more long term.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, I was curious about that because I'd never heard anybody say it. Usually they're used synonymously, like 80% of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I still use the word brainwashing sometimes, but it's a little bit more squirrely in its definition.
Oh, okay.
So on your YouTube channel, you talk about your experiences while you were in the fold, right, as a JW, and now an ExJW activist in a way to help those that are thinking about coming out or providing support, listening. So can you take us to the points where, you're a pioneer, you're working 70 hours extra per month. This is on top of your job. Being a ministerial servant, you're completely in the fold. Kind of briefly take us through that to why you exited and the exit process.
I think a lot of the activity that Jehovah's Witnesses involve themselves in largely amounts to self-indoctrination. So I deeply, I'll just speak for myself here, and I'm sure it doesn't only apply to me. You deeply embed yourself in something to try to silence the doubts. So I'll give you one example. As a ministerial servant, they felt that I was good at speaking, so even though I wasn't an elder, they would have me do the Sunday morning sermon sometimes, which they call a public talk. And they have a list of outlines that you work from, which are provided from headquarters. I mean, everything is carefully programmed, so it's not like you can just talk off the cuff. You're working from their outline, but you fill in the meat. I picked a talk that dealt with an issue that I had doubts about.
Okay.
And that was, the name of the talk was The Earth Will Remain Forever. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that this planet Earth will never die, and that humans, faithful Jehovah's Witnesses that survive Armageddon will live forever on this earth as a paradise. And from what I had heard about entropy and science, that just didn't make sense to me. That, eventually the sun is going to burn out, and you're not going to have a planet Earth to be a paradise. And so that just didn't make sense, and it constantly bothered me. I thought, I'm going to do this talk, and I'm going to research it, and I'm going to prove to myself that this earth is going to last forever. And I found some obscure reference. It wasn't suggested in the outline, but I found some obscure reference that said that if God wanted to, he could refuel the sun. And I thought, that's great. I'm going to put that in the talk. Even though it's not in the outline, I want to hear myself say that to an audience of people, because then it must be true. You know what I mean?
Right. Like Jehovah could reinfuse your faith, he could reinfuse the sun's hydrogen.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be no problem, right? It should be.
Right. So this was all, ways to self-indoctrinate. The more involved you are, the more true it must be, right? That's where I was at. And at about age 24 is when I first started having doubts. And I believe I was a ministerial servant even at that time. So we're looking at 12 years between age 24 and 36 where I struggled with doubts. And I remember how it started. You want to hear the story?
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it started here in Milwaukee at the Milwaukee Public Museum. I was sitting in the OmniMax Theater, the big dome, and I'm watching a documentary about Australia. It was called Australia Land Beyond Time. And it wasn't about evolution, but, if you're watching a nature program, usually evolution gets some kind of like peripheral reference. Mm-hmm. And in the context of Australia, where you have all this weird wildlife that doesn't exist anywhere else, it just, all of a sudden it was like, well, obviously these creatures evolved in isolation here. Evolution is true. And the thought wasn't even that concrete at the time, but it was just a feeling, like a gut feeling. And that was like a window into a bigger world. Right around then is when my panic attack started. I just you can't deal with the thought, so you suppress it. I mean, you guys know what cognitive dissonance is, but it's not a comfortable feeling. It just became overwhelming to a point where I couldn't deal with it anymore because the doubts start compounding. Once there's a kink in the armor, so to speak, other stuff starts to leak through. So more and more things about evolution just started to make sense. And not long after that, the flood just seemed ridiculous. I would say that one was actually a bigger motivator for me than even evolution, just because how absurd the flood is. So many things about the flood. And then, as I mentioned, things about the paradise earth started not making sense, like we're going to live forever on the planet, like our joints never going to wear out, our teeth aren't never going to wear out. What if a coconut falls on my head? How am I going to live forever as a corporeal being on this planet? Just so much of it didn't make sense. Jehovah's Witnesses say that animals are going to be at peace in the paradise, so they won't eat each other. And it's like, I look at animals and I can see there's a difference between a prey animal and a predator animal. They're obviously designed by evolution to be predator and prey animals. You have the prey animals with their eyes on the side of the head for the wide peripheral vision, and the predator animals have the stereo vision so they can hone in on their prey, and they have different digestive systems for different ways of eating. A Jehovah's Witness would say, well, with God, all things are possible. Who knows? Maybe the animals will change in the future. And it's just all magical thinking, and that wasn't working for me anymore. And then later doctrinal things started coming in that didn't make sense. But in the beginning, it was mostly science stuff that just didn't add up.
Right. That makes sense. I always like to add that there's animal eating plants, like the Venus flytrap and other pitcher plants that make their living consuming bugs, not cheetahs, but or deer. But still, I mean, the fact that nothing is going to die, the fact that E. coli are in your bowels.
Yeah, I mean,
something's going to die.
Our planet's not a particularly friendly place, and that's just a cold, hard fact you got to get used to. Some people don't like to think about it, and you'll create doctrines to make it go away, but that's not the reality. So
the exit process itself was somewhat of a formal one. So you weren't caught doing anything bad. You weren't caught on a website that you weren't supposed to be at. You had made a decision that you were going to come in and confess, as it were. And they drew a counsel to what?
No, I avoided that. What you're talking about is a apostasy trial, or what they would call a judicial committee for apostasy, where it would become known that you're, like you said, either looking at apostate websites or that you've spoken to somebody about apostate ideas, and then they would approach you and say, we heard XYZ, we need to talk to you about it. So they might have like a little bit of an investigation with two elders, and if there was definitely a case of it being true, then they would meet with you with three guys. And it's like a star chamber. I mean, you're in a room with just these three guys. You don't have any type of witnesses or anybody to corroborate your story. It's just you versus them in private. And they're trying to find out whether you believe that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses is God's sole channel for revealing truth on the earth. That's the question. That's the $1 million question. They might ask you some extraneous questions, peripheral questions before then. But ultimately, it's like that's the big sin, is to not believe that God is using the leadership of this organization. And if you say no to that, they'll say, okay, well, give us a few minutes. We need to talk. They'll dismiss you from the room. you come back in and they'll tell you you're being disfellowshipped, and that, there's a process for appeal, and that you can, we hope that you come back, which, that's a long process of months and months of being shunned and coming to all their meetings through that. And at that point, why would you do it if you don't believe it anymore?
Right.
But I avoided all that. I just wrote a letter and said, for XYZ reasons, my conscience will not allow me to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses or be associated with the Watchtower organization or any of its companies, and that's it. My door is always open to you. It's not my will to shun, but this is what you do. And
so it was a fair letter, and I always find you to be a very fair and balanced person. So you wrote this is my conscience. You weren't ranting at them. Did they file that away somewhere? I mean,
yeah, that's all kept on file.
Okay.
I'm sure that I still have a card there somewhere that's got my name on it and says that I'm disassociated. And this is why a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses will not disassociate, because you're kind of playing by their rules to an extent. Like, why do I need to give you a letter? Why do you need to write something on my card based off of my choosing to leave? A lot of people will just walk away. Mm-hmm. And I could have done that. And to be honest, I don't know that I made the right choice. There's definitely pros to it. When you formally leave in this way, it opens the door for activism. If you want to leave kind of under the radar, you got to kind of keep your mouth shut, because if they hear that you're speaking out against the organization, they will disfellowship you.
Okay.
So it's going to happen anyways. So a lot of people will just keep their mouth shut, try to, live under the radar, like they won't put up Christmas lights and all that sort of stuff. So I can, at this point, I can live however I want to live, and it doesn't matter. The worst thing that can possibly happen to me already happened.
Right.
So I can, it's a way to put an end on that chapter that's real clean and move forward.
Yeah.
But it's not for everybody, because the shunning is so extreme and so brutal. Whereas there are people that kind of fade away or manage to keep some ties. Again, if it becomes known that you openly disagree, you're still going to get cut off eventually anyways. And if you don't do that, your relationships will be very conditional. It's going to be constantly asking, when are you coming back? When are you coming back? And it's the truth, and that sort of rhetoric. It's a matter of debate in the ExJW community, and I don't know what the right answer is. I think it depends on the person.
Yeah. It sounds like the Watchtower Society is laying down the rules. And if you don't believe that dogma, then you can be a heretic or an apostate. Like heretic meaning you disagree with one piece of the dogma, an apostate, all of it. But it seems like even if you take one chunk out, the rest of the cards will fall. Can you tell it seems like to me the Jehovah's Witnesses love to recite the Bible or back up the doctrines of the Watchtower Society from the Bible. Do they always fit? Specifically shunning. Can they back that one up biblically, or does that just make kind of rational sense? Get the bad apples out.
That's a great question, and it's debatable. They use scriptures to back it. I mean, everything they do is, quote, Bible-based. I mean, Bible-based is like their catchphrase.
Yeah.
Everything's Bible-based. So there's a scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11, where, has anybody ever read a scripture on this podcast before?
Go for it.
Go nuts.
Perhaps. But if you're the first, we'll crown it.
All right, 1 Corinthians 5:11. I'm going to read from their Bible. It says, "But now I am writing you to quit mixing in company with anyone called a brother that is a fornicator or a greedy person or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not even eating with such a man. For what do I have to do with judging those outside? Do you not judge those inside? Well, God judges those outside. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves." So there's a number of phrases in there that are open to your interpretation. What does it mean to quit mixing? Does that mean absolute shunning?
Right.
If it says somebody who is called a brother, what if you don't identify as a brother anymore? And then it says if someone is a fornicator, what if you're not actively fornicating? You just committed fornication, you're kicked out, but you're not actively living that. And then when it says not even eating with a man, I mean, a lot of churches just take this to be about communion, essentially. It's only groups like Jehovah's Witnesses or the Plymouth Brethren would be another example, where they take this verse and say, this means we have to absolutely shun you. So it is in the Bible, but it's open to interpretation, and it's obvious, I think, why the more extreme groups do it. It's a way to maintain membership. Can I share one other scripture?
Go for it.
Okay. I won't read this one, but it's 2 John verse 10. It talks about not receiving the Antichrist into your home or even saying a greeting to them. Again, it's open to interpretation. It's most likely Paul was talking about a kind of a proto Gnostic sect in Christianity that didn't, well, it mentions in the verse that they didn't believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ. If I remember right, I didn't note it. But, obviously he wasn't writing about this sect that would start in the late 1800s with Charles Russell at the helm. But that's how they take it, because the Bible was written for them, and so everything in the Bible applies specifically to that organization. They, they'll talk about historical context, but really what they care about is that this applies to us.
Right.
So they say to not even say a greeting to this kind of individual. So that's their justification for turning the other way if they see you on the street. They won't even say hello. What I find fascinating is to study the development of the policy within this organization to kind of show how it evolved from being kind of just an oddball sect into like this big bloated cult.
Right.
Back in the 1800s, there was general talk about not associating with sinners, but there was no specific policies about casting people out of their organization. Then in the early 1900s, they started a version of disfellowshipping where the whole congregation would get involved in it and talk about the decision, and then the sinner would be treated essentially like a heathen. So they're no longer a member, but it's, again, not that harsh shunning. As late as 1947, they spoke out against excommunication. The Jehovah's Witnesses they always have loved to make fun of the Catholic Church and pick on the Catholic Church as much as possible. So they talk about excommunication as being pagan in origin, and that it's an instrument of tyranny, which is true.
Yeah, it has been historically.
Right. And then just a few years later, 1952, during the third presidency, so we're talking, it was Charles Russell was the first one, Joseph Rutherford was the second, third one was Nathan Knorr. And under Nathan Knorr, that's when disfellowshipping became synonymous with the extreme shunning. And it was also around then that you could be disfellowshipped for disagreeing with any aspect of doctrine. Before that, it was basically you have to accept like the ransom sacrifice of Jesus and just a couple other main Christian doctrines. And like if you don't agree with everything that's in the Watchtower, it's not a big deal. But come 1952, you had to agree with everything they said. And if you sinned seriously in their eyes, which would include disagreeing on doctrine, you'd be shunned with the really harsh shunning. 1955, you could be disfellowshipped for associating with a disfellowship person, which puts a much higher incentive on shunning people.
Yeah.
And then finally, 1981, people that voluntarily resigned for conscientious reasons, disassociated like myself, were also shunned. So in 1981, it was like a light switch. Everybody was trapped. Nobody could leave. You couldn't vote with your feet anymore. And that's, in my eyes, when they kind of crossed that line into full cult status.
Okay. Now you said 1981 or
81. Yeah.
Okay.
It was around then. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually more recently than I expected.
Yeah.
Wow. And where have you been in contact with anybody from there? Like, have you talked to anybody since you left? Even a single person?
My dad spoke to me for a little while immediately following it. I did bump into one person that I knew through my job that was a Jehovah's Witness. Maybe a couple months later, he spoke to me. I think it was kind of on the edge when they're still thinking maybe he'll come back. But with that exception, no.
Wow.
Yeah. You have a great video on your YouTube channel called Mourning the Living. When, you have a parent that dies, obviously there's a mourning process, but when you're shunned and your parents are still alive, but yet you're essentially dead to them. A really good one. I mean, check it up. You can Google this really quickly. Daniel Wiebe, Wiebe, JW will be a first link on Google. Check that one out. It's really good.
Yeah, because when you're mourning somebody who is passed and they're not with us anymore, and it's very tangible, and you go through the stages of grief in a little more. It's an expected way. You expect to go through different stages of grief. And when somebody's still alive, I think denial is much stronger. Like, you just can't believe this. Like, they're right there, but they're not. Mm-hmm. It's called ambiguous loss. And it's different than just grieving a death. So it's challenging, but you can get past it.
That sounds almost harder, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I've dealt with a lot of death in my life. I mean, I think everybody has. It's not like a secret club or anything. But to have somebody that's alive that you have to mourn, that's insane. I definitely want to watch that video.
The other aspect to it is, and I don't want to minimize death because that's awful.
But it happens to everybody, though. Like, it's a thing that's going to happen.
Right.
It's not as...
The thing about Jehovah's Witnesses is that from the moment that you're baptized, once you get baptized, I was 16 when I got baptized, but people are getting baptized, as early as 7 or 8 or 9. As soon as that happens, they hold a gun to the head of every single person you care about. And as soon as you leave, they're going to pull that trigger. It's not just that you lose one person. Yeah. It's not just you lose your parents. I mean, that's bad enough, but you lose everybody. Now, thankfully, I was fortunate enough that I have an extended family that's not Jehovah's Witness, and they have been extremely supportive. Mm-hmm. I got people to celebrate the holidays with, and that's been good.
Right. Yeah, I mean, having your first birthday, you mentioned, because you're not allowed to celebrate birthdays, among other things, folks gave you presents that included some, like a baby rattler or something, which was a kind of a funny joke. Oh, wow. I'd imagine, right. As I get older, in my 40s now, like presents they're not as cool, but if I'd never gotten them, I expect I'd want them double wrapped, so I'd have more wrapping to rip off.
Yeah, that's fair. So you were born into this then? Like this was a family?
That's right. Yeah, I was second generation on my mom's side. She was 21 when she was recruited, and I believe third generation on my dad's side. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Some people are in 4 or 5 generations.
So you really never had a choice. Like you were pretty much born into this. Essentially you didn't have a choice. Yeah, like when your family believes in something, you for a while are going to. It just seems like that's the common thread. That's how most of these religions tend to retain their people generationally. At least that's what I've seen.
Yeah. Interestingly, Jehovah's Witnesses, despite how high the pressure is to get baptized and the consequences for leaving, they have a surprisingly low retention rate.
No kidding.
There's a Pew Research study on this that it's something like 60% that were raised Jehovah's Witnesses no longer identify as Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, that doesn't separate out how many of them just kind of faded away from the religion, how many were disfellowshipped. Some of them maybe were never baptized and therefore aren't shunned. But they have a hard time holding on to members, which I find interesting. The only reason that they are still growing, and it's not a lot of growth, but the only reason they're still growing is because they so aggressively proselytize. Believe it or not, they do have some successes. It's very rare. I mean, it's something like 40 years. I could be wrong about this. Something like 40 years of recruiting hours per baptism. If you average out how much recruiting is done. Please fact check that.
That's a tremendous amount of time.
Right. But they do it so much that they're going to have a measure of success. If you're going through a divorce or somebody just died or you lost your job and somebody knocks at your door saying they're from God and they have an answer to every question you have in a way that the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church didn't, it's going to be a moving experience, and it works. When they hit you just at the right time in your life, it works.
And you said before that being spoon-fed the answers, that there's a real comfort and being told what to think and knowing rather than have to think for yourself. And also, I can imagine the community itself will probably grab onto you. What's it like for a new member when you were there being born in and then somebody new maybe that was kind of didn't really have a community of their own? What was it like? What did they get?
It's incredibly exciting. It's incredibly exciting to be a Jehovah's Witness and have somebody new walk in that door. And you're constantly told to be hospitable to such people, and that you believe that Jehovah is drawing this person, and so you feel this responsibility. Now, from an outsider's perspective, the way what we call that is lovebombing.
Okay.
And all cults do it because they're so bought into this idea that this is the one true path, that when somebody walks in there, you just want to have them join the fold. And your intentions might be good, but that's really hard to resist for an outside person that's searching.
Yeah, because you're going to find maybe the couple people that came to your door that you seem to be friends with, but now you're going to meet 4 more, 10 more, and now you feel like you've got a family, a community, friends, everything.
And it becomes the frog in boiling water scenario because you don't know the weird stuff yet.
Yeah.
It just feels like this really friendly community. There's an appendix in their first study book where they talk about 1914, and we can get into that if you want. But it's basically this claim that God chose their organization, and that this is their organization. He chose them in actually 1919. And Joseph Rutherford was chosen by Jesus in 1919, and that's a super weird claim. But you don't know that out of the gate. That's not something you find out until much later. As far as how you're supposed to treat disfellowship people, the shunning stuff, that's not until the second book. Yeah. You don't even find out about that till the second book, and you might be baptized already. Now, you've probably heard about it by then. You probably understand to extent the consequences of getting baptized, what that all means. But it's a very slow process. Again, frog in boiling water.
Right.
So it ends up being like, as soon as you come in, it's wonderful. Everyone, you love everything about it. And then after you're finally in, they're like, oh, hey, by the way, we got all this extra crap in the back closet here. They open it up and just all the horrible stuff comes flowing out. You're like, wow. I guess I'm in now. It's too late. I didn't know this was in here.
Yeah, Scientology is probably the worst in this category because you actually have to pay to get into the next levels of indoctrination.
Yes.
So you don't find out about Xenu until I forget what level, and by then you've paid so much money towards it, you're like the sunk cost fallacy. You're in.
OT3, I think it is.
Right. It's similar to that. It's not nearly as severe. I mean, I guess the idea is they sell you on the really cool stuff, like you're never going to have to die, that you're going to survive into a paradise, and we have this really tight community, and we look after each other. That once you believe it, some of the weird stuff, it's like, well, that's not so bad.
Yeah, and you mentioned to me earlier that dissent is tolerated, like for the newbie, because it's kind of like, well, why do we do this? They'll allow it. Well, just hold that question; it'll all come true. So the longer you're in, the less dissent they'll take. So the new guy doesn't feel like, wow, they're accepting me, even though I don't quite think like these do. And I think their frog in the boiling water is a great analogy. And this is the Mythicist Milwaukee show. And for me, like the Mythicist argument is what really kind of broke my crack open. Specifically for me, it was Philo of Alexandria, a guy living in a Jewish, Roman citizen living in Alexandria, Egypt. And his specific focus is on Palestine. He writes from 20 to 50. All his records are kept. No mention of Jesus. I mean, wow, Jesus might not even be real. Holy cow. I think that seems to be a mythicist argument for the JWs. And to me, that was the 587 BCE versus 607 BCE destruction of the temple date. And I suspect most people would be like, who cares whether temple was destroyed, 587 BC, 607 BC. Why does it matter, Dan?
Yeah, this is the proverbial red pill. For me, it was anyways. I think that this is enough reason on its own to leave the organization. It's that important. As I've mentioned, their leadership is supposedly chosen by God. I can get into some of the scriptural reasons for that, but that's kind of boring. What it boils down to is something they refer to as the Gentile times. So God had a theocracy on earth, according to Scripture, which you had a king on the throne in Israel, and then
right, David, Solomon,
exactly, up until when Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem.
Right.
So they say that's when the Gentile times began. According to them, that's 607 BCE. Now they use this wild scripture chain that was popular around the time. This actually predates Charles Russell, the founder of the Bible Students, who became the Jehovah's Witnesses. This idea of using the scriptures to come up with this recipe for 2,520 years was popular, and he latched onto it. And if you add 2,520 years to 607, that brings you to 1914, which they say would be the end of the Gentile times, which is to say that God would again institute a theocracy on earth. What they expected the Gentile times the end of the Gentile times to result in before 1914 is totally different than what Jehovah's Witnesses now say the end of the Gentile times means. They now equate the end of the Gentile times with the beginning of the last days. But everything printed before 1914 was about Armageddon coming, the governments would be gone, religions would be wiped out, the earth would turn into a paradise, the resurrection would happen.
There's no shopping malls.
Right. None of that stuff happened. And Jehovah's Witnesses, most Jehovah's Witnesses don't know this. I certainly didn't. That the way the predictions about 1914 are presented in current Watchtower literature is complete misrepresentation of what was actually happening back then. This is why they don't want you to actually look at the old literature. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now 607. What's the deal with 607? Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the last days began in 1914 because Jesus had returned invisibly. Nothing they thought was going to happen happened, but he still returned. Trust us. And one of the first things that he is meant to have done in 1914 was inspect all the religions of the world and looked at what Joseph Rutherford was doing with his cronies and said, this is my guy. I choose these guys. They have the closest thing to the truth, so I'm going with them. And ever since then, this has been God's chosen organization. So looking at the origin of that is super, super important. The very leadership, the central claim of this leadership rests on this date. Trouble is, Jerusalem didn't fall in 607. Jerusalem fell in 587 BCE.
Right, and that's because new archaeology, the old archaeology suggested 607, but the new archaeology, which looks absolutely sound, makes it 587. So all the textbooks have updated this. And this,
correct. And it's interesting if you actually look at Watchtower literature and the length that each of the Neo-Babylonian kings reigned, you can come to 587 BCE. There's an interesting quote in a 2011 Watchtower series that was on this subject, trying to, their apologetics for 607. There was a little footnote, if you were paying attention, and it said, business tablets exist for all the years traditionally attributed to the Neo-Babylonian kings. When the years that these kings ruled are totaled and a calculation is made back from the last Neo-Babylonian king, Nabonidus, the date reached for the destruction of Jerusalem is, drumroll, 587 BCE. However, this method of dating works only if each king followed the other in the same year without any breaks in it. So they're basically asserting the existence of gaps between the reigns of these kings that there's no evidence for. And during that period of Babylonian history, they were meticulous about keeping records. Yep. We would know about this. So even using their own literature, you can show that this date doesn't make any sense. And it's like dominoes then. When you take out 607, you lose 1914. That means Jesus wasn't choosing any religion in 1919, and this whole thing is baloney.
Right. Yeah, that they missed the time. So to me, that kind of crushes the argument, because some would say, well, God, World War I, which happened also in 1914, wow, it looks like it's coming true. Armageddon. If you've seen the pictures of No Man's Land, I mean, it looks like Armageddon there. And then right on the heels of this, a Spanish flu virus wipes out another 10 million people. It sort of seems like the end of the world. That seems credible, but not after the 20-year mix-up.
Right. The coincidence of World War I in 1914, in my opinion, is probably one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that this organization, apart from some of the other Adventist movements of the time, survived so well, because it just seems so miraculous. Right. I mentioned Robert J. Lifton earlier, who talks about the 8 criteria for thought reform. One of them was mystical manipulation, which is where you take a coincidence and imbue it with mystical qualities. And so you gotta snuff out history about how wrong they were, and just take this one coincidence and spin it a certain way. And it seems like Charles Russell predicted the beginning of the last days. That's not what he was predicting. Interestingly, World War I was not the first World War. The Napoleonic Wars, the 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, these are all classified as world wars that happened before World War I. It was not the highest death toll at all. There was maybe 6 or 7 wars before then that were higher. World War II obviously was the highest, but that came later. With the exception of World War II, violence has been on a steady decline since then. We're living, I mean, you look at the news, there's a lot of bad things happening. Yeah. But we're living in the most peaceful time in history. There's less pestilence. There's less poverty. There's less starvation. In every measurable way, things are getting better. So this thing about 1914, he predicted the last days, every aspect of it falls apart. But that connection with World War I, Jehovah's Witnesses just cling to that, and it's mystical manipulation.
Yeah, and it seems like World War I is a place you can get back to in your mind. It's hard to get back to the 100 Years' War.
Right.
Yeah, really hard.
I mean, just to imagine what it is. I mean, you have to know a lot about history and you to get a feel for what's going on.
Exactly.
All right. So, okay, taking it back for a sec to meeting with this invisible Jesus and being told that you're right. What is there anything, how do people believe that? Like, why is that a thing that people, like, what part of that is the believable part? Like, I can't imagine. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. It sounds ridiculous to an outsider.
Fair enough.
But this again goes with the frog in boiling water. If it's all you're ever told again and again, and then they point to evidences besides just World War I, they'll say, I mean, our preaching work could never be as successful as it is if it wasn't for having God's Spirit. And I know so-and-so is praying when Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on their doors. Clearly the angels are backing our work. And
oh, I see. Okay. So it's just,
I mean, you can find these same kind of arguments in the Mormon church. Any of these churches will use the same kind of, quote, evidence evidence to prove that they're the one true church.
I see. So it's just like coincidental sort of anecdotal stuff that they, like it's related. It's a thing that's related to this. Right. And that's why Jesus he's our guy. Like we're his guy. We're bros. Exactly. We're the best.
Right. And the one true church needs to be traced back to Jesus himself, right? That when the folks are calling on me, they're always saying, well, we want to get back to the actual real Christianity Bible. They know the Bible, you can tell. They're telling me to turn to XYZ pages. But there isn't really a true Christianity. I mean, I always wanted to ask them, do Paul's letters ever confuse you? Because Paul's writing, well, hey, don't practice like this. How do you know you got the right one when even Paul is saying multiple people are practicing this way?
Yeah, they don't look at that the same way. They do think of it as being pretty homogenous, that there was this one main form of Christianity that they are replicating, and then there were these peripheral kind of apostate groups that the true Christianity prevailed against. And so there are, Jehovah's Witnesses that leave the fold and become other kind of Christians. Well, they're kind of like those Christians in Paul's time that weren't true Christians.
Right. So they're the tiny thing. So the Catholic Church, which likes to claim that it is like the one true church and seems to have like the most adherents and in the best, like the lineage, they're the breakoff. So the schism became massive, and then this teeny little thing break through. Do they have histories of JWs in, say, the 700s? Do they talk about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So they claim that it's not a new religion, that actually, what was Adam and Eve's? It was Cain and Abel. They say Abel was the first Jehovah's Witness because he was the first faithful one to Jehovah. And then they point to the nation of Israel. They get their name from a scripture in Isaiah where it says, "You are my witnesses," is the utterance of Yahweh or Jehovah. And so the Israelites are Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a passage where it says that Jesus was the faithful and true witness. Therefore, he was one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Okay.
But that they then say that in the 4th century, maybe a little earlier, that the great apostasy set in. And it's really essentially the same thing that any Protestant religion is going to tell you, that there was an apostatizing that happened when the Catholic Church came in. And so the Protestants tried to reform and get back to the true Christianity. And then you go forward further into the first and second and third Great Awakening. Jehovah's Witnesses came out of the Third Great Awakening, where you have these restorationist movements popping up saying, no, they didn't go far enough. We got to go back to square one, throw out all this doctrine and start over.
Right. And then that's what they're doing. So the Watchtower then is the kind of the sole justification of that, right? They're the ones that determine, and everything comes down as new light, if you will. And I want to ask you, okay, we have new light on this issue. Have they ever had a flip-flop case where there was light, then their new light says, no, we were wrong, but then flip back and said that they were?
Yeah, there's a few examples of that. Organ transplants would be one. Organ transplants were considered to be fine. And then at some point, somebody got the idea, somebody high up said, you know what, I think this is actually cannibalism to have an organ transplant. And that got printed in the literature, can't get an organ transplant. That existed for about 12 years. And then they said, you know what, it's not the same thing as eating it. We're going to go back on that. It's okay to get an organ transplant. Another one would be Romans chapter 13:1, talks about superior authorities. They used to say that it was human governments were the superior authorities that you had to be in subjection to. And they said, no, that can't be. We're in subjection to God. So then they changed it to the superior authorities are God and Jesus. And then they switched again back to being that it's the human governments. That's the current belief. Most Jehovah's Witnesses don't know that there was a flip-flop there. And that's not new light. I mean, that's like a light switch going on and off. Another one
so at any given point, you might think they've got it wrong. You can say the same thing.
You don't think that.
But you don't.
They have something called present truth. They want you to keep in step with present truth. Whatever we're saying at the present time is truth, which if that phrase alone doesn't cause you cognitive dissonance, I don't know what will, because if something's true, it's true. But they say present truth without ever implying that what they said wrong before was wrong.
Right.
But they're just more right now. They were right then, they're more right now.
Yeah, there was the truth then, and it is the truth now.
Exactly. It's like the Ministry of Information. You just keep overwriting history.
Man.
But I mean, it seems a lot like, me coming from Catholic roots, papal infallibility. Galileo is wrong. He's a heretic. Oh, no, wait, he was right all the time. I mean, that's an obvious flip. Eating fish or eating meat on a Friday is a mortal sin. Not so much anymore. That's the same flip-flopping. I mean, how do we know? You know, I
exactly.
mean, what about those poor saps back in 1600?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, God, they ate a sirloin and now they're screwed.
Right.
You know, whereas then I get a free pass. Doesn't seem fair.
Yeah. There's been several different policies that have resulted in death for Jehovah's Witnesses or imprisonment at the very least. Like there was a time when you couldn't accept civilian service in place of going to, fighting in a war. Jehovah's Witnesses are conscientious objectors. So in the past would just have to go to jail for that. Well, now you can accept civilian service. That means all those people that were in jail didn't have to be in jail. And then, with the organ transplants thing, presumably during the 12-year period, people died that didn't need to. And then of course, everybody knows about the ban on blood transfusions. That's become more lenient in past years, or in recent years, where now you can accept blood fractions, and they're trying to find these little loopholes where it's saving more lives, but that means that the people that died in the past didn't have to.
Right. I actually looked at the medical literature on this, and there are white paper journals talking about to physicians how to deal with JW patients. They cite the exact passage in Acts that forbids this, and then talk about things they can use. Like in a corneal transplant, you wouldn't need a blood transfusion. Most kidney transplants actually don't need blood. Now, liver almost always does. About a third of lung transplants do. So they talk about other ways like cell savers. That's a way to continuing, and that the JWs talk about like it needs to be a closed loop, and correct me if I'm wrong. So if the suction tube's always there, then it's sort of like its own vein, and then the machine collects it, reprocesses the blood. It's crazy, but they mentioned don't laugh this off to the surgeons. Take it very, very seriously, because if they do it and you just override their beliefs, that they can get excommunicated or disfellowshipped. And they cite that 1%, and they have a citation for it, 1% of people get disfellowshipped per year. And they said that's a big deal. And the only way to get back in is through, they say, 3 months at least to 2 years of genuine repentance.
Right.
So
they've been a little bit more lenient on the disfellowshipping for blood transfusion in recent, I don't know if it's letters or publications, where if you were to get a blood transfusion and not exhibit repentance, then you'd be disfellowshipped. So I guess if you kind of were an unscrupulous Jehovah's Witness who just wanted to live, props to you if that's the case, and you get the blood transfusion and then say, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done that. It was a moment of weakness. My understanding is you might not get disfellowshipped now because of that.
Yeah, there's HIPAA too. It's going to be hard to get at whether you had one.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It's got to be difficult. But either way, we have to start wrapping things up here now. I did have one question, though, because I was reading this, and it was you wrote this, Brian, I believe. The no voting, are they now allowed to vote then, or is it still
no voting? There are some countries where the penalties for not voting are severe enough that they say you can go into a voting booth, and basically what you do in there is between you and God. I mean, you could write Mickey Mouse, you could write Jesus Christ in there, whatever you want to do, but in their eyes, to vote, you're giving yourself the number of the beast, essentially. To involve yourself in the politics of this world, they would say, would be you're no longer an ambassador for Christ at that point.
Okay, I see. And then a theoretical question that you wrote this, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, this is great. What if the JWs owned an island continent? What type of government would they likely set up?
I have no idea. This is a great question. I mean, presumably they would think it was some kind of theocracy. They're essentially pacifists. They couldn't have any kind of a standing army. I mean, there's Jehovah's Witnesses that commit violent crimes. So are they going to have prisons and then guards? I mean, they don't really carry weapons. You can't even be a police officer that carries weapons and serve as, for example, a ministerial servant or an elder. It's a very strange question. I have a feeling that they would have to just ship off anybody that didn't meet their requirements, just kind of banish them from the island. If somebody commits a crime, you just ship them off and let some real country deal with it.
Could you have a democracy, though? Would they be allowed to vote? Assuming that, pacifist country, they're protected by somebody else. Could you?
Absolutely not. I mean, everything about this organization is top down. Nobody has a voice. The only people with a voice are at the very top. I mean, people write in letters to try to get change made. Nothing happens.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been great. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much. It's been awesome.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming on. It's talking about this. I would love to get into the identity politics of Jehovah's Witnesses, because I think that's what keeps you in when you have you're so tied to your identity. It's so hard to leave. And I think the fact that you could break with that and take a look from the outside is probably what makes you so even-handed in your treatment of this, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess there's going to be Monster on Sunday. They're going to be our guest that we're going to have. All right, thank you so much for coming out.
Thanks again, Dan. Check out Dan's YouTube channel at ExJW Moving On. This is the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. Thanks for listening. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. The Mythicist Milwaukee Show is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasick, Associate Producer Fritz Blandone, Engineer Jason Lawson, and hosts Brian Edward and Jacob Wolfel. Every week, we produce a new broadcast that sheds light on religion, secularism, and mythology. If you enjoy this show, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicist. Closing theme, written and performed by Shelley Siegel.